rising unit labor costs like that are bad. Now, especially if you are hoping that inflation is going to come down. Because one way the official measures of inflation, the CPI, one way to keep the CPI from going up is to have growing productivity. Because as productivity increases, costs come down. And that allows the government to create some inflation that doesn't show up in the CPI. Meaning, let's say we're so productive, our productivity is so high that prices would have come down by 3%. But the government creates a bunch of inflation and instead prices go up by 2%. Well, we have 5% inflation, but you only see 2% because you don't see the price cuts that never happen. Or another way to put it, let's say inflation would have been 10%, but because of rising productivity and prices, let's say they would have dropped by 5%, and now inflation's only 5%, at least that's what's reported. So rising productivity makes these inflation numbers look good. But on the other hand, if we're getting falling productivity, it's going to work in reverse. If productivity is going down, well, then prices might be going up based on falling productivity. Then you add inflation on top of that, and it makes it worse. So if you're hoping that you're going to get lower CPI numbers, you need to hope for more productivity to basically reduce the inflation that the Fed is creating, to help get the Fed out of jail by the economy lowering costs in the face of the Fed's inflation, which is raising prices. But if productivity is not helping out, then that goal is going to be much harder for the Fed to achieve. And of course, all this talk about wages going up, people want to talk about wage increases. Those are nominal. There's only one way that you can get real wages to go up, and that's if productivity goes up. Workers have to be more productive to earn more. If they're not more productive, it's impossible for them to earn more. They can only earn more if they deliver greater productivity to their employer, because that's the only way their employer can actually pay them more. So when you see falling productivity, you know that real wages can't go up. In fact, they have to go down in order for people to maintain their jobs. Otherwise, they're going to have to get fired. So this is bad news. It didn't get a lot of coverage, but it should have. Everybody is hoping that the Fed's war on inflation is working, that all these rate hikes are taking a toll, and that inflation is going to come down to 2%. Well, this consumer credit number, and this is one of the biggest numbers we've had in a while. I think it was like the second biggest jump in credit card debt that we've had. If you're getting this big jump in consumer credit, that shows you that the Fed is losing the inflation war. Because, and I've said this on this podcast before, the way rising interest rates are supposed to fight inflation is by making it more expensive for consumers to borrow money. And if they can't borrow as much money, well, then they have to borrow less. And if they're borrowing less, they're buying less. So spending comes down. Demand comes down because credit is more expensive and therefore less available. So consumers borrow less, they spend less. That reduction in demand helps bring down prices. Well, what do these numbers tell us? That's not happening. Yes, the Fed is raising interest rates, but that's not stopping the consumer from continuing to borrow and spend. So that means that these rate hikes are not nearly enough to get the job done. And one of the reasons for that is that interest rates are still negative. So it still makes sense to borrow money if the rate you're borrowing at is less than the inflation rate. Now, I know like people who are buying on their credit cards, and they're paying 20% interest. I mean, that's way above the inflation rate, but they're still borrowing, right? None of this has worked. None of this has stopped people from using their credit cards. If the Fed wants to make headway in fighting inflation, people have to leave those credit cards in their wallets. They have to stop buying stuff on credit, right? That's the demand. Inflation, it's not just money supply, but credit. It's an expansion of credit, and credit continues to expand. And what does that do? That drives up prices. We need credit to contract. That's what we need. That's not happening. And this whole idea, and I've mentioned this before, people keep saying the way the Fed is supposed to fight demand is cause people to lose their jobs, right? We want people to be unemployed so they stop spending. Look, you can be unemployed and keep spending, right? Because people get unemployment benefits when they're unemployed. They spend that. They don't lose their credit cards. Your credit card company doesn't take your credit card away when you're unemployed. In fact, you probably use it more when you're unemployed because your unemployment benefits are lower than what your paycheck used to be. So you use your credit card more. So people keep spending when they lose their jobs. So that's not going to do it. And I've said many times, the last thing we want is for people to stop working. Because if we have an inflation problem, that means we have too much money and not enough stuff. So we either need less money or more stuff or some combination. One way you get more stuff is if you have more people working, making the stuff. But if people lose their jobs, then there's less stuff because they're not making it. So that means more upward pressure on prices. So if the Fed really wants to fight inflation, the last thing they want is people to be out of work. They want people working. What the Fed wants is the people who are working to stop spending. People have to save. Don't go out and buy stuff. Take what you earn and save it. That's what we need. And the other thing about savings is now that represents money that can be loaned to businesses to invest in capital to produce even more. So we want people working and saving so we can make capital investments so we can grow the economy with more production. That's what would help to bring down prices. We don't want to just throw people out of work so they can keep on spending without producing. And that's what's happening. People are losing their jobs and they still spend. And the people who have their jobs, they don't care about rising interest rates. They're spending anyway. So these numbers show you that there is no progress being made on inflation. Everybody wants to pretend that we're getting closer to the 2% goal. We're nowhere near getting back to 2%. As I said, this is a fantasy. Nobody is willing to accept the fact that those days are long over.